It's Cinemassacre's Monster Madness.
The horror genre is a genre that's made up of traditions, certain story elements that always repeat. People go out to a cabin, bad stuff happens, people die, and there's one girl left running for her life. We've seen it all before, we get it. But every now and then, there comes along a movie that's self-aware and pokes fun at the genre, acknowledging that audiences are smarter than that. Cabin in the Woods is that kind of movie. It's a fresh take on a very old and tired concept. A bunch of college students take a trip out into the woods and stay at a cabin. The characters are all stereotypical. They fit every archetype of the genre. The good girl, the naughty girl, the jock, the nerd, and the pothead. So at first it seems the movie's really stale, but then it starts playing some really fun games and you realize the stock characters are all intentional. The less you know, the better. I would suggest going into this movie with as little expectations as possible. That's why I'm going to say, spoiler alert. If you haven't seen it, stop right here and just go watch the movie. I don't promise a horror masterpiece, but if you want something that's a little different, I recommend it. So, you ready? Let's move on. It turns out the cabin is actually part of a scientific experiment, and deep below it is a laboratory where scientists are responsible for all the horrors that they face. The scientists are my favorite part of the movie. They have this dry, sarcastic sense of humor, and they treat the whole situation like it's another day at the office. They place bets as to what will happen to these people.
The board is locked! Oh, let's get this party started!
They're unsympathetic that they're treating these people as guinea pigs, but it's just like the filmmakers who are masterminds behind the whole thing, or the audiences themselves who vicariously watch everything, and we don't feel we get our money's worth until we see people die.
Fuck you! Fuck you, fuck you, fuck you, fuck you, fuck you! They fucked us! How hard is it to kill 9-year-olds?
As the movie unravels and we go deeper into the sublevels of the cabin, all kinds of stock monsters begin appearing all over the place. This is where the movie becomes truly worthwhile. It's this final act that is like a giant tribute to all horror movies and a game to name that monster. That one looks familiar. It's a total free-for-all. It feels like anything can happen in this movie, and that's what you call fun.
Cinemassacre's Monster Madness.
Some of the creepiest horror films ever made are from the silent era. Hexen from 1922 is no exception. Somehow the scratched up image and the complete lack of sound create a disturbing tone. I think it also has something to do with knowing how old these movies are. They were made with outdated film techniques, and it's a miracle some of these movies still exist today. It's like unearthing an ancient artifact. There's no actors we recognize, nobody to connect it to. My grandparents weren't even born then. So we feel very distant to these kind of movies, and that adds to its atmosphere of mystery and haunting quality because we're so detached from it. What makes this one especially interesting is that it has some pretty scary images. It involves the devil, it exploits the topic of witchcraft, and there's some nudity. It pushed the boundaries of horror back then to an extent that seems unimaginable for those days. To sum up this movie is difficult because it combines so many stories. It's a hodgepodge, it's all over the place. It begins as a documentary about the ideas of witchcraft and hell in the Middle Ages, and even goes so far to talk about all the outdated concepts of how the universe works. These are my favorite parts because it makes you feel like you're being educated back in ancient times. The biggest drawback, I think, are the titles, which is the nature of silent films because that's all they had. Yes, like I said, the silence enhances the nightmarish mood, but the titles often linger way too long and it slows down the experience. After the documentary part, it segues into a series of live-action, fictional narratives, little stories that make up the majority of the film. Here we see both actual depictions of witchcraft and women in the Middle Ages who are accused of being witches. The images are unforgettable. It definitely has some of the best shots in silent horror history. One of the most memorable characters is the Devil, who was actually played by the director himself. The film was a Swedish and Danish production. It was re-released in the United States in 1968 as Witchcraft Through the Ages. It was cut down and a voiceover narration was added.
In the bowels of the earth was hell, and its eternal torments, one of which was to find yourself being put into a boiling cauldron.
The shorter runtime probably has a lot to do with all those title cards in the documentary portion being cut out. I think the narration helps the documentary portion tremendously, but what's up with that jazz score? Either way, you can find both versions on the DVD release by Criterion.
Cinemassacre's Monster Madness.
Alice, Sweet Alice, originally titled Communion, is a slasher mystery from 1976 directed by Alfred Soule. The story begins when a little girl, played by a then 10-year-old Brooke Shields, is brutally murdered and burned during her first communion. We aren't shown who does the killing, but as suspicion grows, we're led to believe that it was her older sister Alice. Right from the start, the movie establishes a religious tone involving guilt and denial. Alice's mother defends allegations that her child is a killer, even though she starts to have second thoughts about it.
Alice! Liar!
It was filmed in Paterson, New Jersey in the mid-70s, but I believe it's supposed to take place in the early 60s, given the clothing style and things like a JFK picture on the wall. It's never really confirmed though. Oddly enough, the time period and the styles work perfectly for the creepiness of this film.
Alice!
The killer, who may or may not be Alice, uses a kitchen knife, wears a classic yellow raincoat, and has one of the creepiest masks in all of horror cinema. It's like a translucent doll mask that looks slightly like Lon Chaney in Phantom of the Opera. I'm unsure of the origins of the mask, but I would assume this kind of mask was originally used in theater or masquerade parties. But nevertheless, it was a brilliant choice to use one of these for the movie because it is absolutely disturbing in this context, or any. Alice lives in an apartment building and is constantly harassed by her nagging aunt and a pervert who lives down the hall. You kind of empathize with her because she's so mistreated. The style of the film is paced very slowly, but has big payoffs. The camera is always moving and peering through windows or other foreground objects. It's very well shot, but with all the organic, crude ingenuity of a low-budget film. The striking colors and clashing light and shadow remind me of the work of Italian horror master Dario Argento. The religious communion theme gives a contrast to the horror and bloodshed, which only makes it more unsettling. It has all the great elements of slasher cinema from Texas Chainsaw Massacre to Halloween. But for some reason, Alice, Sweet Alice never got that much recognition and is one of the more underrated films of this genre.
Cinemassacre's Monster Madness.
Horror legend Vincent Price makes his appearance this month's Monster Madness, but in very strange circumstances. Here we find him as the host of a very bizarre TV show from 1971, The Hilarious House of Frightenstein. This is the weirdest thing I've ever seen him in, and one of the most incredible finds I've stumbled upon in recent years. How could I not be aware of a monster sketch comedy show that starred Vincent Price? Well, it was the product of an independent TV station in Canada, and only recently surfaced on DVD. The format of the show was child-friendly, and man, I would have loved this as a kid. Each sketch has its own zany personalities and horror stereotypes. First you have Count Frightenstein and his assistant Igor. The Count is a mashup of a mad scientist and vampire all in one, and for some reason he has a green face. As a scientist, the only thing he does is make stupid inventions, like a soda called Dracola. There's a monster on a slab that he's trying to revive, but he never gets up. Then you have Griselda, a witch, who is, of course, the cooking segment of the show. The ingredients are all ridiculous and obviously nothing you would want to eat, but this witch really loves her work. She shows so much enthusiasm that it's like everything she throws in her pot is the best thing ever.
Oh, what's this? Oh, okie and okie oil. Well, it's okie with me.
That's horrible.
Then there's the librarian. This is my favorite segment because it's so awkward.
I am the librarian. I'm going to tell you tales of horror.
It sets up an atmosphere like it's going to be creepy, but as the ancient librarian starts to tell you his scary story, you realize it isn't scary in the slightest bit.
And our story today is Too Many Daves.
And then he gets disappointed about it.
Terrifying, wasn't it? Wasn't it? Don't you feel your flesh crawling? No?
There's too many things to highlight, but you can't forget about the Wolfman DJ. There is a famous DJ named Wolfman Jack. Anybody who's heard of him, I'm sure, has always wanted to see a DJ that's literally a Wolfman. Then we go into this trippy music video segment where the Wolfman pretends to play guitar and dances in front of a green screen, often joined by Igor. It goes on for a very uncomfortable period of time. I mean, they do the whole song like this. You get the sense that the people who made the show had a lot of fun with it. Anything goes here. It's a must-see for at least one episode if you're a fan of the classic monsters, the psychedelic nature of the 70s, and Vincent Price. It's surprising that Vincent Price would want to be involved in a show like this, given his sophisticated acting background. He was classically trained in theater and had a very wide range of performance. Basically, he's the kind of actor that you'd think would be trying to win an Academy Award. But he remained loyal to the horror genre. He didn't mind being typecast with a genre that tends to get frowned upon. He embraced horror and approached every role he did seriously, or humorously if needed. Here you can tell that he's really loving it.
And yesterday it showed a man who was falling from a tree. Oh, I wish he'd fix that crystal ball, 'cause that falling man was me.
I've heard that he liked doing films that were popular with young audiences because they would grow up being fans, and that would ensure the longevity of his career. And that is pure genius.
Cinemassacre's Monster Madness.
Thrill me.
Night of the Creeps. This is one of those 80s movies that pays tribute to the 50s, but goes down in time as an 80s movie. I don't know how to explain it, it just has that good old 80s feel. It was directed by Fred Drecker, who also did Monster Squad. As soon as it starts, we see aliens chasing after another alien who's stealing a canister that contains God knows what. The aliens' facial expressions are frozen into a permanent frown. They look just like the angry video game nerd. The canister ends up getting shot out to Earth in 1959, where a young man finds it and some kind of slug jumps into his mouth. And there's also an axe-wielding murderer, as if there isn't enough things going on. But forget all that. We fast forward to the 80s. The setting, a college, where we meet some freshmen who are trying to get into a fraternity house, but first have to pass a test to steal a dead body from a lab. Well, it turns out the body has been cryogenically frozen, and it was Slug Boy from the 50s. So what happens here is these alien slugs get loose, they crawl into people's brains and turn them into zombies. Pretty standard stuff, but awesome, especially because the effects are all handled right. It's the perfect blend of humor and scares. The characters are typical but likable. You have the nerdy kids, the bully, the chick that everybody wants, but the guy who just totally owns this movie is a detective who's all fucked up in the head because of his bad experiences. And he was the same guy who was on the case in the 50s. And now he has to take down the alien slug zombie menace using a flamethrower and one-liners.
It's Miller time.
Miller time? I don't get it. Why does he say that? Anyway, I love this guy. He's played by Tom Atkins from Halloween 3, The Fog, and numerous others. My favorite scene is when he tells the kid the story from his past. It's so awkward and creepy.
I leveled off that shotgun right at his chest. Spanky, guess what happened next?
Should you be telling me this?
Close. I pulled the trigger.
That's all real exciting.
Then Dick Miller shows up. Always good to see him.
You need your basic flamethrower.
Flamethrower? Flamethrower?
Yeah.
It's not a real 80s movie until Dick Miller is handing out weapons.
You can't do that.
All the characters are named after famous horror directors.
Cynthia Cronenberg.
Detective Cameron?
Hey, Cunningham.
Mr. Miners. Raimi.
And we're,
Christopher Romero and James Carpenter Hooper. Landis.
It's just another example of how it's such a big tribute to the genre. It even has Plan 9 from Outer Space showing on the TV. I see this movie as more of a comedy first. It's got a little bit of Animal House and Revenge of the Nerds in it, and it turns into a zombie horror movie by the end. The last act is when things get good. If you're a lover of the genre, I recommend it. Also, if you want some more alien slugs, check out Slither. It has some of the best special effects of the 2000s. There's some CG, but most of it is the good old practical stuff. It seems to pay tribute to the 80s, and part of the inspiration may have been Night of the Creeps.
Thrill me.
Cinemassacre's Monster Madness.
We had to get at least one movie from the 40s in here, and at least one with Lon Chaney Jr. This was before The Wolfman. The actor had not yet made an impact in the horror genre, although he was well known for his great portrayal of Lenny in Of Mice and Men, alongside Burgess Meredith. So here, Universal Studios was already trying to make him up to be the next big horror star. The first time was not the charm, but it's still very interesting to watch if you want to see where Lon Chaney Jr.'s career in the horror business got its start. In Man-Made Monster, he plays Dynamo Dan, the Electric Man, a carnival performer who does tricks with electricity. He's the only survivor from a bus crash. The bus happened to skid into some electrical wires, electrocuting all of its passengers. Because of Dan's special tolerance to electricity, he makes it out alive. This puzzles the doctors and attracts the attention of a mad scientist played by Universal regular Lionel Atwill. The scientist begins conducting experiments with electricity using Dan as his human guinea pig. Dan goes along willingly, but as the experiments continue, he becomes tired and depressed and develops an addiction to the electrical shocks.
You like these treatments, don't you, Dan? Yeah. They make me feel strong like I used to. They wear off too quick.
Fully immune to the effects, the scientist ramps up the voltage and turns him into a glowing electrical monster, deadly to the touch.
Don't touch it. It's full of electricity.
The same kind of thing has already been done in The Invisible Ray with Boris Karloff. That time it was radiation, but they used the same glowing effect, and he also kills people with his touch.
It'll be easiest just to shake hands. It'll all be over in a second.
Karloff seemed to have a curse for this kind of thing because it happened to him again in 1965 with Die Monster Die. Chaney exhibits the same kind of likable charm that fans would recognize from The Wolfman. His character suffers that same kind of tragic fate. Even in his descent from man to monster, deep down inside, he still retains his humanity and tries to do the right thing.
You keep telling yourself you got evil.
I like to think of Dynamo Dan the Electric Man as a superhero. He certainly has superpowers, and he fights against a villain, which in this case is the power-hungry mad scientist.
Stop, I tell you! Stop! Can't you hear me? Stop! I'll take the power out of you!
This is your basic run-of-the-mill entry in the Universal horror cycle. It has all the cliches. A scientist, a monster on the slab, a girl being carried away, half of the lab equipment is all stock footage from Frankenstein, and everything down to the title is as generic as it gets. But it's entertaining and is barely an hour long. It flies by and is very easy to watch. As long as you're not expecting anything special from it, and you're a Universal Monster fan, then it's definitely worth seeing.
Dan, don't you know me?
It's Cinemassacre's Monster Madness.
The Texas Chainsaw Massacre from 1974 is a great example of a low-budget exploitation movie becoming a classic. Its documentary-style camera work and raw, bare-bones production value subjected you into the experience, which made for a horrifying trip. Everything clicked together perfectly. But with all the sequels, they've never been able to capture that rare creative strike of lightning, which only happened once. As you've seen from previous Monster Madness years, we've taken a look at Part 2 and 3, and each sequel got worse. After 3, how much worse could it get?
Oh, you motherfuckers, don't tell me what I should do.
Well, guess what? Texas Chainsaw Massacre: The Next Generation sinks to an impossible low. This is the kind of movie you just have to see for yourself. There's nothing I can do to explain it. Basically, some high school girls are out on their prom night, they get into a car crash, they find an old Texas farmhouse, and what do you know, come into the grips of an insane family. It's more like a remake. The only thing that's sequel about it is the opening prologue, which mentions the other incidents. After a slow and dull build-up, it finally gets entertaining near the end. It's the classic freak show screamfest scene like in the original, but this time it's just downright funny. Matthew McConaughey really hams it up. This guy is a fucking nut. The original movie somehow worked. It did a good job showing crazy characters in a way that was disturbing, but every time they made a sequel, it would come off as a total spoof. I don't know what the magic ingredients were the first time, but it's clearly never been duplicated. Look at this guy. What is his deal? And this girl, played by Renee Zellweger, is really fucking dumb. She has a gun pointed straight at him. Why doesn't she shoot? She just stands there and even lets him put the gun in his mouth. This is the craziest, most absurd scene in a horror film to feature two actors who would go on to win Academy Awards.
And the Oscar goes to Matthew McConaughey.
And the Oscar goes to Renee Zellweger.
Kim Henkel, who co-wrote the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, wrote and directed this one. It was made independent and low budget, so you would hope that would all help connect it to the first movie and make it feel like the first true sequel. But that only gets your hopes up and makes it fail even harder. It first played in film festivals under the title Return of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Then it was recut and released by Columbia in a limited theatrical release in 1997 to capitalize on Zellweger and McConaughey now that they were becoming more well known. Of course, we can't end without mentioning the series' most iconic character, Leatherface. In the first movie, there was a scene where he was wearing makeup. I think the idea was that he had a split personality and was taking the role of the housewife of the family. But in this movie, he goes full transvestite, and that's it. The idea has also been done with Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs, but here it just comes off as stale and unnecessary. It's a perfect example of a great classic to go way downhill, and it might be the most ridiculous string of sequels ever made to a famous horror film.
Get that bitch! Go!
Cinemassacre's Monster Madness.
Night Gallery was an anthology TV series that ran from 1970 to 1973. It was hosted by Rod Serling of Twilight Zone fame. While The Twilight Zone leaned more towards science fiction, Night Gallery leaned more towards the horror genre. I think The Twilight Zone was one of the best television shows of all time. If you're looking for a follow-up to it, or just curious to see what else Rod Serling has done, then you come to Night Gallery.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the Night Gallery.
But if you're expecting Night Gallery to be anywhere near as good as The Twilight Zone, you'll be sorely disappointed. It's been said that Serling didn't have the same kind of control he did over the show as he did on The Twilight Zone, and didn't contribute to as much of the writing, which may explain why it didn't have the same level of quality. But there is one thing that makes it worthwhile, and that is the pilot episode, which is actually a full-length feature that aired in 1969, before the series officially began airing a full year later. So I like to think of the pilot as its own separate thing. It's divided into 3 stories, the first being The Cemetery starring Roddy McDowall, who you might know from Fright Night or Planet of the Apes, if you ever knew it was him under all that ape makeup and prosthetics. Here he plays a man who's waiting to inherit a fortune from his rich uncle.
Seeing that my mother was the major beneficiary and I am her sole survivor, well, that would mean that everything would come to me.
The man's not dead yet. Do you suppose you might stifle those great expectations of yours till the body's cold?
He basically murders him, and the uncle gets buried in a family cemetery that's right next to the house. On the wall, there happens to be a painting of the cemetery that's 100% accurate. So accurate that he can see the vengeful uncle rising from the grave. I saw this as a kid, and it scared the hell out of me. And to this day, I still think the idea of the painting showing what's happening is a great concept. The second story is called Eyes. This one is about a mean old rich woman played by Joan Crawford who's blind. All she wants is to see, if only for a day, so she pays a man for his eyes.
I want to see something. Trees, concrete, buildings, grass, airplanes, color!
It may not sound like that great a plot, but the build-up and the payoff is excellent. How did this episode come out so well? Perhaps because it was directed by a young Steven Spielberg. That's right, before Jaws, there was Eyes. The third story, The Escape Route, is about a Nazi war criminal running from his personal demons. This one's not as great as the others. Beyond this pilot episode or feature film or whatever it is, the only episode of the series that really sticks out to me is The Little Black Bag, because it stars Twilight Zone veteran Burgess Meredith. The plot about a futuristic medical kit that gets sent back to the past isn't so interesting. It's the performance of such an incredible actor that makes this one a must-see.
Why, there are some men who topple from grace. But I was shot down into the depths like a projectile. From a man of medicine to a panhandling wino with perpetual winter in my bones.
And also, we have a very odd performance from his friend, played by Chill Wills.
Everything you make, we're gonna split 50-50.
I don't know what this guy's deal is, but man, is he funny. So when it comes to Night Gallery, those are my recommendations. See The Cemetery, Eyes, and The Little Black Bag.
It's Cinemassacre's Monster Madness.
For today's Monster Madness, let's go to Italy for The Black Cat, directed by Lucio Fulci, who had his own prolific run of horror films, contributing to the genre with both atmosphere and gore. One of my favorite works of his is The Black Cat from 1981. Now, to jump straight to the point, this movie is actually about a cat that's going around killing people. You'd expect the cat to just show up on occasion and wander about being all sinister and shit. But no, this cat is the star of the movie, and it's a fucking beast. I mean, this cat could take on Michael Myers. The effects are pretty good. It's a real cat, but when it's attacking and tearing people's faces off, they use a fake claw, which works surprisingly well. I also really like the main character, the cat's owner, who's trying to communicate with the dead using recording equipment. His face is striking. There's just something about him, his crazy eyebrows and staring eyes, that make him look totally insane. The actor is Patrick McGee, probably best known for his appearance in A Clockwork Orange. He has a great presence that lifts the film up when nobody else is interesting. The cinematography is another thing that's remarkable about this film. There's a lot of close-ups of eyes, maybe too many, it could be a drinking game, and there's many low-angle POVs of the cat. All around, it's very good at sustaining a creepy atmosphere. It doesn't go straight for the gore, it's heavier on mood. The plot is the only thing weak here. Basically, the man has a lot of grudges against people and is using his cat to do the killing by sending the souls of the dead people he's contacting to go into the cat. It doesn't make any sense, but you could say the strange plot adds to the surreal, nightmarish quality. You know, I once did a video about the top burning scenes and the top window jumps. This would have been the best of both. How the fuck did I miss this? Of course, this is loosely based on the same Black Cat story by Edgar Allan Poe. The original story was about a man who murders his wife and hides her in the wall, but he accidentally sealed up the cat in the wall too, so when the police arrive to investigate, the cat's meowing is what gives him away. It wasn't the first time anyone tried to adapt the Poe story into film. There was the 1934 Universal film starring Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff. Then there was the 1941 film, also from Universal, and starring Basil Rathbone and Lugosi in a small role. Neither one of these movies had anything to do with the Poe story. There was also the 1962 Roger Corman film, Tales of Terror.
The cat.
One of the stories featured Peter Lorre as an alcoholic and Vincent Price as a wine snob.
Bring on the wine.
Both of them are at their best here, especially Peter Lorre, who is fantastic.
You do it your way and I do it my way.
I highly recommend this one. It follows the basic elements of The Black Cat, but invents a lot of its own.
Don't make so much noise, I don't like it.
But there is also a little-known movie in 1934 called Maniac, which was about a scientist, but loosely followed the Black Cat story. For a 1930s film, you'd be shocked at how much nudity is in it. And they have the nerve to depict the most disturbing scene from the Poe story when the man cuts the eye out of the cat. Even though it's just a cheap effect, you can't help but think, what the fuck did these assholes do to this poor cat? But from what I've read, they never hurt the cat. Obviously it's a fake eye, and the cat supposedly really was missing an eye to begin with, and that's why they used that cat. So basically the cat was fine. I mean, today the cat's nothing but dust, but you know.
It's Cinemassacre's Monster Madness.
It's Hammer time. We gotta do it. How could we have Monster Madness without at least one Hammer film? Well, we did the whole Dracula series and the whole Frankenstein series. I've also mentioned The Mummy 1,000 times. Go see it, it's one of the best. But now, let's look at a lesser known movie, The Vampire Lovers. This was the first in a trilogy centering around vampires from the Karnstein family, the next two being Lust for a Vampire and Twins of Evil. So that's a whole other Hammer series you might not have known about. The Vampire Lovers was based on a novel, Carmilla, which is a vampire story that is even older than Dracula by at least 25 years. This came right about the time when Hammer films was on their way out, and soon movies like The Exorcist and Texas Chainsaw Massacre would bring on a new age of horrors. Hammer knew exactly what to do, so they gave it their all. They pushed this film to the extremes. They ramped up both the gore and the sex, filling the screen with blood and boobs. Ingrid Pitt plays the bisexual vampire Carmilla Karnstein, who seeks male and female victims. It wasn't her only vampire movie. She was also in Countess Dracula. Carmilla, or Marcilla, or whatever the fuck name she wants to go by, takes a female victim who happens to be the daughter of a general played by Peter Cushing. Yeah, of course, you gotta have Peter Cushing. Unfortunately, it's not that big a role, but it's a perfect fit because he has to avenge his daughter and put the vampire to death, just like good old times. The whole movie is full of great atmospheric shots with castles, cemeteries, and fog. It has everything that makes old horror movies appealing, but takes a bold leap into the modern age. There's head decapitations, vampire sex, horrifying deaths, and a hot naked Ingrid Pitt. This is so violent and erotically charged that it's easier to associate it with a sleazy grindhouse cinema than with classic horror. Bottom line, you get the best of both.
Beware the vampire lovers.
Cinemassacre's Monster Madness.
In previous Monster Madnesses, we've covered the critically acclaimed shocker classic The Exorcist and the hilarious nonsensical flop The Exorcist II: The Heretic. You'd think the series would have been doomed at any chance of making any further sequels, but then came along The Exorcist III: Legion. This time they got serious again, or at least tried to. The original author of The Exorcist, William Peter Blatty, wrote this sequel, both the book version and the screenplay. And not only that, he directed it. You can't get much closer to the original idea than that. No Linda Blair this time, but Jason Miller returns as Father Karras, the priest who fell down the stairs and died at the end of the original Exorcist. How does he come back? Well, apparently, when the demon Pazuzu, who was never called by name in the first movie, has been playing a game of soul swapping for the past 15 years. Basically, the soul of a dead serial killer known as the Gemini Killer is in Father Karras' body. Now he's in an asylum as an unidentified patient, and somehow in 15 years, no one has ever figured out that he looks just like Father Karras.
It's a wonderful life.
Not until an old friend of Father Karras recognizes him, who is a detective following a recent string of murders which also bear a strange resemblance to the killings done by the deceased Gemini Killer.
The man in cell 11 is Damien Karras.
The plot is strange and somewhat convoluted, and it moves along at a tediously slow pace. Almost every scene begins with a whole bunch of close-ups of whatever objects are in the room. I mean, it happens so often it could be a drinking game, but I wouldn't recommend it. I can see they're just trying to establish the mood and suspense, but my god. The entire movie is saved by one thing: Brad Dourif, who plays the Gemini Killer in the body of Father Karras.
It's the torment of your friend, Father Karras.
Yeah, they switch back and forth between the two players. I understand that it's a split personality, but it's not as if the character is actually changing between Father Karras and the Gemini Killer. It's always the Gemini Killer speaking, at least for the most part. And the detective never acknowledges the change, so it's not like it's happening in his mind either. It's really just for the audience. I don't fucking know, but no matter how confusing and undecided this movie gets, I can excuse it because Brad Dourif is absolutely amazing.
A decapitated head can continue to see for approximately 20 seconds. I always hold it up so that it can see its body. It's a little extra I throw in for no added charge.
The whole finale was added on by the studio executives because originally there was no exorcism anywhere in the movie. This isn't a typical case of studio executives ruining a movie. I think they made the right decision because the movie really needed it. Anyway, what can I say about this movie? It gets mixed opinions, and that's because it's a very mixed movie. When it gets good, it's good. I'd even say it's phenomenal. It just takes a while to get there. You need to have some patience with it. The plot isn't so great, but it has an indescribable, creepy, and powerful aura, and all the scenes with Brad Dourif shatter your senses.
He will never get away! His pain won't end!
Cinemassacre's Monster Madness.
They Live is a bizarre science fiction action movie with lots of social satire. The whole thing plays out like a comedic version of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and has flying saucers right out of movies like The Day the Earth Stood Still. All the movie tributes shouldn't come as a surprise, as this flick was directed by John Carpenter, who, like many directors of this time, grew up watching monster movies of the 50s. Our star here is Roddy Piper of wrestling fame that goes to the city looking for work. One day while at the church, he stumbles upon an amazing set of sunglasses that allow him to see the world as it really is. Every magazine and billboard carries messages that tell human beings to be greedy and stay passive to forms of authority. It also has to be mentioned the whole scenario with the sunglasses was parodied a few years later in the NES game Bart vs. the Space Mutants. It turns out to be a huge scheme put into action by alien invaders who are posing as regular citizens in disguise.
You're okay. This one, real fucking ugly.
As you'd guess, it pisses Roddy Piper off that his race has been overtaken by aliens, and he goes on an ass-kicking smackdown, taking out as much alien scum as he can with a pump shotgun. At one point, he convinces another guy named Frank to join the struggle to save mankind by making him put on the sunglasses to see reality.
Try these on.
Look, you crazy mother.
At first, Frank doesn't want to put the sunglasses on, so Roddy Piper has to force the glasses on him in a good old-fashioned street brawl. This happens to be one of the longest, most prolonged fistfights ever witnessed in any movie. I believe the point of the fight scene going on for so long was to convey how in real life, often the underclass are too busy fighting amongst themselves and acting like fools.
Put on the glasses!
When they should be working together to form a revolution, or something like that. They Live is open to some interpretation. It's full of interesting ideas, but more than anything else, it's a great tribute to the movies of the 50s. And that's what the 80s were all about, paying tribute to the movies that the directors of this time grew up with. And now, people are paying tribute to the 80s, so it'll just keep on going. And at last, They Live is full of memorable quotes.
I have come here to chew bubblegum and kick ass. And I'm all out of bubblegum.
Cinemassacre's Monster Madness.
We had to get some kaiju action for this year's Monster Madness. Since we've already taken care of all the Godzilla films, let's turn to another Toho monster, Rodan. Released in 1956, this was the studio's first monster movie in color. Godzilla was temporarily in hibernation, literally buried in ice for the time being, so now was the time to focus on other monsters. The plot centers around workers in a coal mine who are baffled when some of them go missing. Turns out that deep within the mines, there are creatures that are sort of like giant caterpillars that are killing everybody. Even worse, they leave the mines and spread terror throughout the village. It's a strange start to a movie that's about a giant winged reptile, but for now, it's caterpillars, which are actually a kind of dragonfly larva known as Meganolon. We center around a character named Shigeru who has amnesia after surviving a cave-in inside the mine. He's the first one to see Rodan, but he needs to regain his memory before he can tell us about it. It's a very slow build-up to the real monster of the movie. It does a good job at creating suspense. We really get inside his head and all the miners, who convey a sense of claustrophobia and delirium. When Shigeru's memory comes back, we learn through a flashback that Rodan hatched from an egg inside the mine and ate the Meganolon. Next, Rodan attacks the major cities, and this is where things get good. The destruction scenes are always the highlights. Here's a surprise. Rodan is joined by a mate. That's right, there's actually 2 Rodans. For some reason, it's always easy to forget about that. If you're a fan of Japanese monster movies, Rodan is one of the essentials that you have to see, because it's one of the first. The effects may be a little primitive. With all these kaiju films, the effects generally got better as time went on. But because it's so early in the genre, it's a commendable effort, and the idea to have a flying monster was very ambitious. When I first saw this as a kid, the VHS copy from the video store was the English dubbed version. Seems nowadays there's a much larger market for subtitles. Back then, dubbing was the only way you can see them. Since that's the version I grew up watching, I've always appreciated that one. I like the narrator's voice and how he draws you into the story.
One thing that disturbed them was the fact that number 8 mine was going too deep. Far deeper than any vein they had ever worked.
An interesting side note about the dubbed version is that a lot of the voice work was provided by George Takei, best known as Sulu from Star Trek. But there's other changes in the American version. It begins with stock footage showing atomic bomb testing.
But what have these tests done to Mother Earth? Can the human race continue to deliver these staggering blows without arousing somewhere in the depths of Earth a reaction, a counterattack, a horror still undreamed of?
It's the same kind of thing you see in lots of 50s monster movies, but I like it. I can't get enough of it, so I can't live without both versions. Rodan would become a main recurring monster in the Godzilla franchise, appearing again in Ghidorah, the three-headed monster, Godzilla vs. Monster Zero, Destroy All Monsters, and several others. But they never brought back both Rodans. It was always one monster from then on. The same thing happened with Godzilla vs. Mothra when the 2 baby Mothras hatch at the end of the film. Then in Ghidorah, the three-headed monster, the twin fairies explain that one of them died. I guess Toho always regretted introducing their monsters in pairs. Even the Meganolon had a lifespan outside of the first Rodan movie. In Godzilla vs. Megagyrus, they return in several forms, including as dragonflies and as the giant Megagyrus that fights Godzilla. And that brings us back full circle. Godzilla is where it all started, but Rodan came close in his mighty wake.
Cinemassacre's Monster Madness.
How do you sum up Beetlejuice? I really don't know. It's one of the strangest movies ever made to get mainstream attention.
It's showtime.
When it came out in 1988, it was a big deal. There was even a cartoon show. but I can't say I understood what this movie was all about. It frightened me, it perplexed me, but all these years later, I still don't get it, but I love it. A married couple, played by Alec Baldwin and Gina Davis, die in a car accident, but continue living in their house as ghosts. At first, they don't realize they're dead, but then new residents move into their home who they don't want there, so they try to scare them away. Even though they're able to do some freaky things, being ghosts and all, it doesn't work, because nobody can see them, except for the dark, depressing daughter played by Winona Ryder.
Live people ignore the strange and unusual. I myself am strange and unusual.
Then they find out about Beetlejuice, a bio-exorcist who may be able to scare away the living, but he might not be worth the trouble.
Can you be scary?
What do you think of this?
Beetlejuice is played by Michael Keaton, who does a wonderful job.
What are your qualifications?
Well, I attended Juilliard. I'm a graduate of the Harvard Business School. I travel quite extensively. I lived through the Black Plague, and I had a pretty good time during that. I've seen The Exorcist about 167 times, and it keeps getting funnier every single time I see it. Not to mention the fact that you're talking to a dead guy. Now, what do you think?
The performance is sort of a mixture of a clown, a zombie, a scary monster, and other assortments of things I can't quite put my finger on. He's completely unpredictable. It's a very unique role, played largely for laughs, which could have been disastrous, but given the quirky and zany tone of this movie, it fits in perfectly well. I can't even recognize that it's Michael Keaton. The makeup is so good, it won an Academy Award.
Hey, there goes Elvis!
It was directed by Tim Burton, so it's very possible that if he made this movie much later, the role of Beetlejuice would have been played by Johnny Depp. This was when Michael Keaton was Tim Burton's man, because right after this, when he made Batman, Michael Keaton landed the role of the Dark Knight himself, twice.
I'm Batman.
Speaking of Batman, notice the bat wings on Beetlejuice's head. That's some strange foreshadowing.
Nice fucking model!
Well, that's proof that you can say fuck in a PG movie and then have a cartoon. Visually, all around, it's an A+ job. The whole movie is a mind trip. The best words I can use to describe it are surreal and crazy. It looks like a child's nightmares come to life. The music by Danny Elfman is another ingredient to the mix that adds to the atmosphere of darkness and playfulness. It's all the things you expect in a Tim Burton movie. Maybe that's how I should sum it up. It's a Tim Burton movie. Enough said. It's an artistic vision that could only come from him. It's an auteur movie. If such a thing ever existed, this is it. It seems like the imagination came straight from the mind to the screen without any question. There's no reason it should work, but it does, as long as you let your mind go. It defies every mainstream convention, but somehow became a mainstream success. It's proof that originality pays off and that movies today don't take big enough risks. Sure, it might not have the most sound plot, and it's really offbeat, but every time I watch it, it keeps getting better.
Save that guy for later.
It's Cinemassacre's Monster Madness.
When it comes to giant monsters, the first that come to mind are usually King Kong and Godzilla, but the beast from 20,000 Fathoms deserves to be right up there with them. It's one of the most imitated monster movies of all time. In fact, it predates Godzilla by 1 year. It was based on a short story by Ray Bradbury, who was a good friend of Ray Harryhausen, the special effects artist. The film begins in the Arctic with scientists experimenting with nuclear bombs. The detonations thaw from the ice a prehistoric reptilian creature. The monster makes its way to the northeastern United States, where it destroys a lighthouse. It's an iconic scene which was the focus of the Ray Bradbury story. Next, the creature makes its way to New York City, where it gives King Kong a run for his money. You know the whole monster on the loose scene, the monster stomping his way through town, the crowded streets of people running. All these conventions began with this movie. Even the scenes with the scientists speculating on what the monster is, that would be repeated in every Godzilla and Gamera film. It all started here. If I didn't talk about any of the human characters, that's because they don't matter. That's not to say the rest of the film isn't well made, but the monster is the star. Ray Harryhausen said that Hollywood would usually glamorize the actors, but he wanted to glamorize the monster. He succeeded in stealing the whole show. The creature, or Rhedosaurus as it's known, is one of your best examples of the art of stop motion, where the monster is sculpted by hand and painstakingly animated frame by frame. Harryhausen did all the animating by himself. He felt that way he could concentrate better without the distraction of having a crew. This also meant he worked long hours all by himself, enough to make a normal person go crazy. The Rhedosaurus looks amazing. It doesn't take much to appreciate. You look at it and it's instantly appealing. I don't know how to explain it. It's just a cool looking monster. Every shot it's in is well executed. He's always doing different lighting effects with it. I especially like when it comes in and out of the shadows. It's just well crafted all around. This was Harryhausen's first major work by himself, after having already worked on Mighty Joe Young with his mentor Willis O'Brien, who animated the original King Kong. What else can be said about this movie? It inspired a whole generation of creature features. It tapped into the growing paranoia of nuclear weapons and was one of the first, if not the first monster to be awakened by an atom bomb, which would happen to countless other monsters in the 50s. Simply put, it's one of the most important monster movies ever made.
Cinemassacre's Monster Madness.
There's been so many Dracula movies that it's almost impossible to keep track. It's no wonder why, because it's one of those stories that deserves being retold generation after generation. By the 90s, it was time to revive the count again for new audiences. This version was given all the treatments of a big-scale blockbuster, including a large budget, mainstream actors, lavish production design, and a highly acclaimed director, none other than Francis Ford Coppola. A side note, one of the producers was named Fred Fuchs, best known in the video game world as the inspiration for the non-existent Fred Fox. One minor gripe I have with the film that I must get out of the way is that it begins with a backstory to Dracula that was never in the novel. All around there are many differences, which are expected, but the movie is called Bram Stoker's Dracula. I think if you're going to put his name on the title, you better stick as close to the book as possible. But with that said, it is much closer than most film versions. To adapt the Bram Stoker novel faithfully has been attempted many times before, including the 1970 version, Bram Stoker's Count Dracula starring Christopher Lee. This version was also pretty darn close, but also has its differences. The movie is a fresh new take with a unique vision, and that's why I think it would have been best to call it Coppola's Dracula, which has already sort of become the film's unofficial title. The movie is very much a visual work of art. Almost every shot is worthy of being framed on your wall. When I saw this for my first time, I remember seeing the eyes superimposed over the sky and immediately being entranced. Being a huge fan of the Bela Lugosi Dracula, I was always against remakes of my favorite classic films, but when I saw that shot, I knew instantly that I was watching something new and special. Then I saw Dracula and laughed my ass off. Really? What's up with the hair? What were they thinking? I mean, seriously, what were they thinking? The actor, of course, is the super talented Gary Oldman, the modern-day man of 1,000 faces. He's good in everything he's in, his acting has a wide range, and on top of that, he always seems to undergo wild makeup changes. In all the movies I've seen of his, it took me many years to start to realize that it was the same actor. Even in this one film, he goes through several looks. Dracula changes from an old man to a young man, and other times he's a wolf or a giant bat. But of all the different appearances of Dracula in this film, I'll always remember that stupid beehive hairdo, or whatever you'd call it. It's unfortunate that it ruins part of the movie for me. Every major version of Dracula has its iconic image that you remember, something that pops into your mind right away whenever the movie's mentioned. Nosferatu has the creepy shadow on the wall, the 1931 version has Lugosi's staring eyes, the Hammer version has Christopher Lee's bloody fangs, and then you have this. This is one blunder, but the rest of the overall design of the movie is fantastic. I could praise the visuals forever, but unfortunately the visuals come before everything else. Some of the acting, especially from Keanu Reeves, is wooden and hollow. The narrative structure is weak. Whenever I watch it, I never feel hooked or drawn into the story. My attention is always on the technical details. It just feels like a bunch of over-the-top vignettes. Short little scenes that each seem to be exploding with drama. It may come off as a little bit disjointed, like separate epics are strewn all together, but to be fair, the novel itself is told through all the different journals and letters written by all the characters. Each one has its own feel and its own writing style. So with the movie, they managed to capture some of that vibe. As a horror movie, I think it's a great visionary epic. The only reason I would be hard on it is because it's Dracula. It could have done better justice. That's not to say that the Bela Lugosi version didn't have its flaws, but that movie is a timeless classic.
I am Dracula.
This one does not go down in history the same way. It could never be as important to the genre, but for the good things I like about it, it's worth seeing.
Cinemassacre's Monster Madness.
Dr. X is about detectives who are investigating a string of murders committed only on the nights of full moons, and the victims have all their flesh chewed off.
This is cannibalism.
The search leads them to a mansion of a doctor who is conducting strange experiments. The film holds the distinction of being the first horror feature to be shot in color as early as 1932, when all the most famous horror movies were shot in black and white. This one used an old Technicolor process where two strips of film were dyed and combined together to create all the weird colors you see here. I often wondered how it would have looked seeing it fresh on a movie screen in 1932. I bet the colors have deteriorated over the years. In fact, this movie was hard to find in color for many decades because it was also released in black and white. The color copies were released in limited supplies and reserved only for major cities. I like the unique color. It sort of reminds me of looking at an old faded comic book from the 30s. Speaking of comic books, the Doctor's name is Dr. Xavier. I can't help but think of Professor Xavier from X-Men. The character was sort of parodied in Mickey Mouse cartoons with Dr. Triple X, but is more or less their take on the generic classic Mad Doctor stereotype. Dr. Xavier is played by Lionel Atwill, who would soon land a supporting role in almost every Universal monster movie of the late 30s and early 40s. His daughter is played by Fay Wray, best known for King Kong. There is also actor John Ray, cinematographer Ray Ranahan, makeup artist Ray Romero, and with all the talk of X-rays, you think this movie might have enough rays. Now all we need to do is watch it on Blu-ray. There's a lot of sci-fi techno-babble going on.
The rotor of the electrostatic machine is connected in multiple series with a bank of glass plate condensers.
And some real gruesome scenes where the killer monster reveals himself, plastering his face with flesh. I still don't know what the hell's going on here, but it's great. Even though this movie pushed the envelope of horror, it has a lot of comedy relief.
I'm so afraid. I'm shaking like a leaf.
Keep quiet.
It was advertised more as a comedy than as a horror film. Here's some more trivia. It was directed by Michael Curtis, who's made several highly acclaimed films like The Adventures of Robin Hood, Captain Blood, and Casablanca.
He's looking at you, kid.
Speaking of Casablanca, the star, Humphrey Bogart, was cast in the quasi-sequel Return of Dr. X. You might be wondering why Humphrey Bogart was in a horror movie, let alone a subpar horror sequel. Well, apparently, he didn't know either. He was quoted as saying, "I had a part that somebody like Bela Lugosi or Boris Karloff should have played. I was this doctor brought back to life, and the only thing that nourished this poor bastard was blood. If it had been Jack Warner's blood, maybe I wouldn't have minded as much. The trouble was they were drinking mine, and I was making this stinking movie." Wow. Just from that quote, the awesomeness of Bogart has just boosted even higher.
It's Cinemassacre's Monster Madness.
Insidious is the story of a family who are having problems with the supernatural. After a strange occurrence in the attic, their son goes into a coma. They soon find it's no ordinary coma. He's been taken over by a demon. I'm glad that for once it's not a little girl who's been possessed. The little girl possession movies have been done to death. It's over. It's been over since The Exorcist. Also, this boy never jumps up and does scary things. Instead, the whole movie is about trying to get him back. It seems as if the movie's divided into two distinct parts. The first half is all about the parents trying to figure out what's wrong with their son. In the middle, an expert comes in and explains everything that's happening. And the second half is all about the spiritual stuff and exploring a paranormal world to find him. The first half, you could say, is easier to relate to because it's grounded in the real world. But I find the first half to be kind of boring because nothing much is happening. Usually I think that can be better because your imagination is much stronger than what any movie can throw in your face. But for me, with this movie, it's the other way around. I think that's because of the subject matter. I've never been a huge fan of ghost stories because ghosts are such an abstract concept to think about. I need the explanation to get me hooked. So in the middle, the expert comes in and explains to them that their son has a talent of leaving his body. When he sleeps, his soul travels all over the place. He thinks he's just dreaming, but he goes too far out there and his soul has become lost. Now that makes his body an empty vessel for all kinds of demons to try to take over. I think that's a pretty creepy idea, and having that knowledge makes the rest of the movie more interesting.
And the problem is that with his astral body gone, he's just left us with a physical body, an empty vessel. And there are entities that know this because they can smell it.
But you can also say the second half is harder to identify with because when the father has to leave his own body and travel into the paranormal world called the Further, everything becomes visually surreal and bizarre, especially the demon with the red face who looks like Darth Maul. The end is visually the best part of the movie. This is where it turns into a spooky haunted house film with lots of strange creatures and ghosts. Surprisingly, this movie doesn't use any false jump scares which are so common in modern horror films. You know what I mean? Here's a regular jump scare. And here's a false scare. The false scare is when there's nothing really there. They're just trying to fool you. It's cheap and it's stupid. Insidious takes the high road and doesn't use any false scares. Also, it barely uses any gore at all, so if you want to see a modern horror movie that relies on classic chills, then check this out. It's nothing too original. The idea of parents trying to get their child back from a supernatural world has been done many times before. There was the Twilight Zone episode called Little Girl Lost, where the daughter somehow slipped through an invisible portal in her bedroom and is stuck in another dimension. It has that same kind of thing where the adult has to go into this dimension to rescue her. It was done again more famously in Poltergeist, where another young girl is abducted by ghosts. It also has the parapsychologist woman who comes in and explains everything that's going on. These conventions have been repeated so many times because they work. The idea of something bad happening to your child is a frightening concept. It's easily relatable, and when you top it with supernatural forces that you're powerless to control, that makes it even more terrifying. Speaking of kids, what happened to the other two children? During the second half of the film, you never see them again. Makes you wonder. Anyway, Insidious. Check it out.
It's Cinemassacre's Monster Madness.
Murders in the Rue Morgue is a somewhat forgotten horror film, despite that it was made by Universal right after Dracula and Frankenstein, and before The Mummy. It came out right in the heart of the Golden Age, and stars Bela Lugosi, but somehow this one didn't become a beloved classic like the rest. The plot is loosely based on an Edgar Allan Poe story the same name, but draws more of its influences from The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, with its German expressionist-style production design and its tale of a carnival performer who this time has a sideshow ape instead of a sleepwalker. Lugosi plays Dr. Miracle, who is looking for a human mate for his ape. His motives are pretty confusing. He kidnaps innocent women and injects them with the ape's blood, which always kills them. But he keeps searching for someone who has compatible blood so he can prove humanity's kinship with apes.
We shall know if you are to be the pride of science.
The rest of the film plays like a murder mystery, but I find it kind of hokey and silly that at the center of it all is an ape on the loose, which is sometimes a real ape and other times a person in a costume. This same kind of costumed ape monster would be repeated countless times in other movies, and is always just as ridiculous. There's one scene in particular that I absolutely hate. It's when a group of witnesses all claim to have heard the suspect speaking, but they can't agree on what language he was speaking.
I heard the voice, but it was not Danish. It was German.
This happens to be one part that actually was in the original Poe story, but in the film it feels out of place, as if it was meant for comedy relief.
Ich lege meine Hand auf Jubels Feuer, dass es kein Deutscher war. Oh, no, Sie doch non c'è nessun italiano capace di come German. Herr Daumer, jetzt hier über German. Ja, will ich getrieben, jetzt hier über German. Hände gegen Deutschen in Paris.
I wish these guys would just shut the hell up and move on. This movie has its flaws, but there's also some highlights. The scene that sticks out to me, strange enough, is when the girl is on the swing. It feels like we're swinging with her. You don't see such creative shots like this that often in early cinema, so it was kind of an ambitious idea. Otherwise, the scene has nothing to do with anything and would have been boring, but because of this creative camera work, I always remember it. The production design is excellent, Lugosi is creepy, the scenes where he's tormenting the girls are effectively disturbing, so there are enough good things going on for this film that make it a minor classic.
You're stubborn! Hush!
During the finale, the ape carries a woman across the rooftops. This scene is taken directly from The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Like all great stories, they're retold. They reshape themselves and evolve, because what happened next the following year was King Kong. Once again, it was an ape carrying a girl on top of a building. It no longer bears much similarity to Caligari, but here we have two famous scenes, both iconic in their own way. Murders in the Rue Morgue was the missing link.
Cinemassacre's Monster Madness.
Do you love scary dummies and mannequins? Then you gotta see this. Are you afraid of dummies and mannequins? Then stop the video right now. Tourist Trap from 1979 is the essential horror film in this category, yet it is somehow strangely overlooked. The plot is nothing special. Some people get a flat tire and go out to find a gas station where all of a sudden, this happens. Holy crap. Are you freaked out yet? It's so weird and disturbing that I find myself laughing at it. It has no rhyme or reason. These mannequins come out of nowhere. The rest of the gang meets a man who lives out here in this barren landscape. He takes them back to his house where he used to run a museum of animated wax figures. That was until the main highway got moved away. He's sort of a Norman Bates type character. He seems fairly innocent and sympathetic, but a little shady at the same time. He has a story about a dead wife and keeps her memory alive with a wax figure. Then overnight, shit starts happening. Missing people, a masked killer, and mannequins coming to life. The film could have played out well enough without the supernatural elements. The masked killer is truly frightening, and his method of murder is unique. Smothering people in plaster. That's how you make a mold of somebody's face for a wax figure or something of that sort, but imagine the idea of having that done without any holes to breathe through. Pretty horrifying. The supernatural elements are creepy too, but it feels like two separate movies playing at once, for better or for worse. The wax figures moving around with their blank expressions and the ghostly sounds of moaning and laughter all create an atmosphere of constant dread. This movie borrows a lot of stock elements, but it fashions them together brilliantly. It has a little bit of Psycho, a little bit of House of Wax, a little bit of the Twilight Zone episode After Hours, and a lot of Texas Chainsaw Massacre. In fact, Robert Burns, who worked on Texas Chainsaw Massacre, handled the art direction here and the mannequin special effects. The production design is fantastic. Every room in the house is filled with scary wax figures. No shot feels empty. You can always see faces staring at you from every corner and the background. For a movie with such a small cast, it feels like every scene is crowded and that you're never alone and always being watched, and it gives you a relentless vibe of paranoia. I wonder why this movie is so underrated. It could have been a classic like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but it was forgotten, just like the old wax museum itself.
Cinemassacre's Monster Madness.
Island of Lost Souls is another horror gem from 1932. I swear I don't plan it this way. 1932 just happened to be a huge year for horror films. The Mummy, White Zombie, Vampire, Freaks, The Old Dark House, and we're still counting. By the way, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde premiered on New Year's Eve 1931, but its general release was in 1932, so that's a close one. But anyway, Island of Lost Souls is the first screen adaptation based on the H.G. Wells novel The Island of Dr. Moreau. A ship crew member named Edward Parker is stranded on an island where he meets Dr. Moreau, who is conducting strange experiments in a place called the House of Pain. Parker hears what sounds like screams of torture, so he pries and investigates until he finds out what Moreau is doing is turning animals into people using surgical procedures. At first, Moreau finds Parker to be a nuisance, but then he decides to use him in his experiments to mate him with a panther woman.
The only woman on the entire island. Well, I leave you two young people together.
The whole idea is that Parker doesn't know she was originally a panther, so this is the ultimate test. But Parker has a fiancée back home, so he's resistant. The plot may sound strange, but it's done justice with the very charismatic Dr. Moreau, played by the great Charles Lawton.
Someday I'll create a woman and it will be easier.
who was in the old dark house and played Quasimodo in the 1939 version of Hunchback of Notre Dame. His Dr. Moreau comes off as cool and rational, not a stereotypical raving mad scientist. You can tell he believes in his experiments, even though it's inhumane and disturbing. His performance helps save it from being just another generic movie about the dangers of science. Coming 1 year off the success of Frankenstein, it has many similarities, even the God line.
Now I know what it feels like to be God.
Do you know what it means to feel like God?
There's also Bela Lugosi in a very odd role as one of the man-beasts, unrecognizable with his face buried under fur and makeup. He's the leader of the rebellion and rallies all the other animal people to revolt against Dr. Moreau. It's a unique part and very creepy in its own way.
You made us in the house of pain, part man, part beast.
It has that same eerie quality that so many early 30s horror films had, with gruesome subject matter but without any music. Even in this pre-code era, this film was banned in some countries. The final scene when the beasts revolt is one of the most effective horror scenes from the Golden Age. It was produced by Paramount, but somehow found its way into the Universal catalog. In the 90s, it was released on the same VHS collection as Dracula, Frankenstein, and all the rest. That's where I first saw it, the good old Universal Monsters Classic Collection. But now you can find it on DVD or Blu-ray from Criterion.
It's Cinemassacre's Monster Madness.
I've already reviewed the first Child's Play, but I'm jumping ahead to the fourth entry in the series for good reasons. Clearly by the title, it's a reference to Bride of Frankenstein and all the different Bride of movies that it inspired. It even makes a direct reference by showing Bride of Frankenstein on the TV, edited effectively into a murder scene. So Chucky kills his girlfriend from his past life as a human serial killer and revives her as a doll. Then the two of them go on a killing spree.
No!
Bride of Chucky, I think, is the best of the Child's Play sequels. The first movie was a horror film with slight touches of dark humor.
You stupid bitch! You filthy slut!
But this one has crossed over completely into a fully realized dark comedy. We've already gotten used to scary Chucky in the first movie. The serious tone worked the first time, but Child's Play 2 and 3 were getting stale. I don't always like seeing franchises that began as serious get diluted into something that's meant for cheap laughs, but in some cases it works, like Evil Dead.
Swallow this.
This is a movie that took me over 15 years to fully appreciate. When it first came out, I thought it was your average modern-day commercial horror bullshit. It was too self-aware. It was clearly trying to be a bad movie on purpose, but without the natural cult appeal of accidentally bad movies like Plan 9 from Outer Space and The Giant Claw. But now, I look back at it with pure nostalgia. It's a bad movie from our generation, and it holds up today. It deserves its spot in the Cult Hall of Fame for its particular era, and it represents the time in which it was made.
A true classic never goes out of style.
The soundtrack instantly takes me right back to 1998. With Monster Magnet and Rob Zombie all over the radio waves, the choices were obvious. Both these bands had breakthrough albums that year. In fact, it was Rob Zombie's debut after separating from White Zombie. I saw both Monster Magnet and Rob Zombie live that year together, and it was one of my fondest concert memories. And here they are, both in the same movie, but it even goes back to classic White Zombie, right after Chucky switches the radio station.
Jesus, the music scene's gone to hell since I've been dead. That's more like it.
This brings me to my next point, how likable of a character Chucky is. I agreed with him that the radio usually played crap, and laughed at the idea of a horror villain, a serial killer doll who likes the same music as me. And then in some kind of sick way, I thought to myself, Chucky could be my friend.
What are you, fucking nuts?
He's alright with me. Then I realized how realistic the character seems to be. The animatronics are amazing. The face is always expressive. You never get the sense that the animatronics are repeating the same facial movements more than once. It's always something unique to the situation.
Smell woman.
The voice is perfect. I'm glad they got Brad Dourif for every movie because I couldn't imagine Chucky with any voice other than him. He truly brings life to this inanimate doll.
Shows how much you know.
It's the first movie where Chucky is the star and has a chance to develop his own personality further. He also has a new look with stitches all over his face. This would become the Chucky that I would recognize best. He has a wider range of emotions and situations that he finds himself in. He even has sex with another doll, which brings me to the bride, Tiffany, voiced by Jennifer Tilly. Her personality is all the way up to speed with Chucky's.
What would Martha Stewart say?
Fuck Martha Stewart!
She isn't just an add-on character, she fits right in with him. She actually has more of an important role than the bride in Bride of Frankenstein did, who only appeared at the very end.
The Bride of Frankenstein.
Just like any married couple, they don't always get along. They bicker, they insult each other, but at the end of the day, both these killer dolls were made for each other.
Cinemassacre's Monster Madness.
Of course, you all probably know King Kong, the most epic fantasy adventure film of its time. Released in 1933 during the early sound era of film, it was a very ambitious production. The special effects, as well as music and sound design, were all very sophisticated for its era. It's one of the greatest cinematic achievements ever. See my Monster Madness review from a few years back. But now, let's get to the sequel. Yeah, the sequel, Son of Kong. I bet many people didn't even know this movie existed. That's because we're always too busy talking about the original. It's one of the first monster sequels ever made, and is the first Son of movie. Following in this tradition would be Son of Frankenstein, Son of Godzilla, Son of Blob, and even... if you want to count that. After King Kong opened as a smash hit in New York in March 1933, Marion C. Cooper, who directed it alongside Ernest B. Schoedsack, went to meet with the RKO studio executives and said he wanted to make a sequel and that he wanted to be even bigger and better than the original. The RKO board told him that's fine, but under certain conditions. The film would have half the budget of the original and be finished and released by December, only 10 months away. And by the time they started filming, they had only 9 months. 9 months to finish the whole movie. The reasons were simple. The studio wanted to have the first movie still fresh in people's minds, because back then the idea of doing a sequel was a new thing. They didn't want people to forget about the original. They also didn't want other competitors to come along first and make their own King Kong ripoffs. And they also wanted it in time for the Christmas holiday season. To these knuckleheads, all that was more important than making a good movie. Luckily, the creative team did the best they could. It's no masterpiece, but it's much better than you'd expect. The plot feels like a natural continuation of the story. It has many of the same actors and feels just like the first movie is still going. It picks up almost immediately where it left off, with Carl Denham suffering from his share of hardships and paying the price for bringing King Kong to New York City. After the giant ape made his rampage through town, everybody is suing him for damages. He meets up again with the ship captain, Engelhorn, who's partially responsible, and they both go out and try to make some money shipping cargo. The movie continues at a leisurely pace and takes some time before the real action starts, very much like the first movie. My favorite standalone scene is when they stop to see a little show, and part of the performance involves real live monkeys playing instruments. It's a funny contrast to the giant monkey that caused all the destruction, but aside from that, it's simply hilarious. Apparently the show is tanking really bad, but I don't get it. This is great. There's this one little awkward pause where the monkeys all stop for a moment. It's just a funny, unnecessary scene with an awkward tone that I can't describe. The show is a small production run by one man and his daughter Hilda. Denham gets to know her, and the dialogue between them is rather charming and humorous.
Did you ever catch a monkey?
Did I ever? Lady, you'd be surprised.
Her father is an alcoholic who gets drunk one night with a shady fellow named Hellstrom. After insulting him, Hellstrom gets angry and in a drunken fit murders the father. Turns out Hellstrom was the man who originally gave Denham the map to Skull Island where they found Kong. Now he's telling them that he knows of a treasure that's hidden there. While it's the last thing they'd want to do, Denham and Englehorn need the money badly, so they agree to take Hellstrom with them to return to Skull Island to find the treasure. Really, Hellstrom is a crooked scoundrel who is using them. Hilda stows away aboard the ship and is out for revenge against Hellstrom for killing her dad. It's a fairly complicated scenario, but all this character development is crucial to what makes the film so entertaining.
Well, here we are. Just one big happy family.
Next thing, they're all thrown into another adventure, running from giant monsters and meeting the baby Kong, who they find stuck in quicksand. Denham helps the poor ape out, and they become friends. In return, Little Kong helps fight off all the other hostile beasts. Willis O'Brien is back doing the special effects. This is the biggest area where the movie suffers, unfortunately. The stop motion is still very impressive, but you can tell it's being rushed, and there's some cartoony moments. Lots of the model creatures are the same exact models recycled from the first movie, like the Brontosaurus and the Styracosaurus that was cut the first time around. Even Baby Kong is made from the armature of one of the original Kong models. Still, there's some new creatures, a cave bear and a sea serpent. Considering these special effects scenes had to be made in less than 9 months, they're very good. It's a shame this movie is so overlooked. Any negative reception it's had is because nobody's given it a chance or has unreasonably high hopes that it will be as good as the original. The real shame is that had it not been rushed, it could have been. The characters are all great, even down to Hilda's drunken father, who is only a small part. Robert Armstrong is the real star here. He's an excellent actor and is even better in this movie than he was in the first one. His character is developed further. Denham's learned from his mistakes. He does things that redeem himself. He saves the baby Kong, and he's actually very likable this time.
I'm the guy that knocked out your pop with a gas bomb and then carried him off to New York in chains. I've been sorry for it ever since. Well,
the movie is more about the characters than it is about the monster scenes. For the budget and time constraints, it was wise that they didn't try to top the first movie. This one is more humble and has a sense of humor. The Kong legacy lived on. In 1949, there was Mighty Joe Young, another movie about a giant ape, unrelated to Kong, but this is an outstanding film that I highly recommend. It also stars Robert Armstrong as a similar kind of showbiz character who starts out greedy but then redeems himself. And the effects are again done by Willis O'Brien with the help of Ray Harryhausen, who he was passing the torch to. Harryhausen, who as a kid was inspired by Kong, carried on the stop-motion legacy and took the monster adventure genre to all new heights. With The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, It Came from Beneath the Sea, Jason and the Argonauts, the Sinbad movies, Clash of the Titans, and too many others to count. Willis O'Brien continued working his monster magic with the Black Scorpion, the Giant Behemoth, and his final job was the ladder scene in my favorite film of all time, It's a Mad, 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 Mad World. From what I understand, his involvement in this scene was brief because he died during its production. As for Kong, he lived on kaiju style in the 60s with King Kong vs. Godzilla and its follow-up, King Kong Escapes, where he fights Mecha Kong. Then there was the 1976 remake and its atrocious sequel, King Kong Lives. Then there was the Peter Jackson remake from 2005, which was extremely passionate and faithful, even if a bit too long. Since all the other Kong movies had one sequel, I always thought there should be a sequel to the Peter Jackson version. But hey, there is going to be a new King Kong movie of some kind. It's going to be called Skull Island. We're in mid-production here at Monster Madness, and this just got announced this year during Comic-Con. We'll see how the movie turns out. Revive King Kong as a robot and have him fight the new Godzilla. King Kong versus Godzilla. It's time for a rematch, but I won't hold my breath.
It's Cinemassacre's Monster Madness.
Stephen King's It was a 3-hour TV movie that aired in 2 parts. I remember distinctly in 1990 when this thing was on TV, it was a big deal. Everybody was talking about it.
Aren't you going to say hello?
I was 10 years old at the time, and I remember during most of it covering my eyes or leaving the room. And I also remember the uncomfortable nature of the cliffhanger at the end of part 1 and waiting with nervous anxiety for the conclusion. After it was all over, I realized there was nothing scary about it at all. Appropriately enough, the movie is about kids who are afraid of it. What is it? It's a mysterious being that takes different forms to prey upon children's fears. The film jumps back and forth between 2 time periods, with the main characters as children and as adults. As children, they all get together to fight it while running from bullies at the same time. As adults, they realize that it comes back every 30 years, so they have to fight it again and kill it for good. The main form of it is a clown, played by Tim Curry.
Pennywise the clown?
That's him.
In the movie Legend, he was the devil, and in Rocky Horror Picture Show, he was the self-proclaimed sweet transvestite from transsexual Transylvania. So he's had his share of horror-related roles. The whole clown thing confused me since I was a kid. I thought maybe one of the kids had some strange fear of clowns, maybe he had a bad experience with a clown one time, but they're all afraid of him. And he's not really that scary. Sure, he has razor-sharp teeth and a creepy voice, but most of the time, he's just goofing around. He's actually pretty funny. I think this was a missed opportunity to play on other phobias. Sure, other things happen, like a mummy and a werewolf, but they're all pretty cliche for things that are meant to be phobias. The movie sort of tries to do what Nightmare on Elm Street did, but not very well. I think the reason this movie is so popular is because so many people are afraid of clowns. I never heard of that until this movie. Even though there were movies before it, like Killer Clowns from Outer Space, Stephen King's It was the one that put the image of the scary clown into the mainstream. By the way, it also wasn't the first movie title to emphasize the word it. There was It, the Terror from Beyond Space, It Came from Beneath the Sea, It Came from Outer Space, From Hell It Came, and a bunch of others. The kid actors are pretty good. Wouldn't it be an interesting idea to reshoot the scenes with the adults to have the actual same kids now that they're grown up? That would be awesome. Overall, I find the movie to be pretty average, but it's almost good. It almost has something working for it. It didn't see its full potential. Maybe that's just because many Stephen King movies work better as books. Lots of the film adaptations aren't very good, but there are many great ones like The Shining, Misery, Stand By Me, Carrie, and The Shawshank Redemption. But for many of us kids at the time, It was the one that put Stephen King's name on our radar. I like to look at this movie with a child's perspective. For me, It is a nostalgia trip, like remember when this used to be scary? Just like the characters in the movie, we confront it again after all these years. It's about children and it's about imagination. I never thought that it was actually real. I always felt that it was all about overcoming an imaginary fear that may have helped these kids run away from their real life problems, like the bullies. The methods they use to fight it are so naive. Slingshots, silver, and even an inhaler.
This is battery acid, you slime!
In this way, I find it to be very similar to Dracula, using crucifixes or holy water, things that people have faith in that give them comfort. A talisman, a repellent, whatever it may be, it's something more special and less tangible than a traditional weapon. Also, like the Dracula novel, it's all about close friends getting together to join forces and fight an evil being. Like it, Dracula takes many forms: a bat, a wolf, even fog. Also in it, there's a bully character who goes insane and grows up in an asylum. It influences his mind and has control over him, using him as a servant almost to attack the other characters. It's very much like Dracula, who uses Renfield. It's the same theme of an immortal being who has limits and needs the help of a live person. So, to wrap things up, I think the movie's okay. It just could have been better, that's all. Now for a spoiler alert. If you don't want to know what happens at the end, stop here. But I must comment. The ending, when the adults face the true form of it turns out to be a giant stop-motion spider which looks like it came right out of a Ray Harryhausen movie. For the special effects, this is my favorite part of the whole film, but after 3 hours, it comes out of nowhere. It's so off-key from the rest of the movie. I'm very conflicted as to whether this ruins it or makes it more awesome. One last note, the DVD I have is very confusing. It's double-sided, which I already hate because they're easier to scratch, but anyway, it doesn't tell you which side is part 1 and which side's part 2, and if you're not familiar with the movie, you wouldn't even know there were 2 parts. Both menus look exactly the same, and unlike the original TV showing, there's nothing at the end of the movie to say "to be continued" or "flip the disc over for part 2. How hard would that have been? And likewise, part 2 doesn't tell you to watch the first side first. This is a load of shit. Wikipedia says the DVD came out in 1999, Amazon says 2002, the actual DVD I have says 2010. Maybe those are wrong, or maybe it's been released many times, but hard to believe they'd fuck it up more than once. I guess they were just clowning around.
Cinemassacre's Monster Madness.
The Night Walker is an overlooked gem from director William Castle, known for his low-budget B-movies like House on Haunted Hill and The Tingler. He's even better known for his theatrical gimmicks, like hiding electric buzzers in the audience's seats and flying glow-in-the-dark skeletons over their heads. But with The Night Walker, there's no gimmick. Instead, we get a legitimately suspenseful and eerie story written by Robert Bloch, the author of Psycho. It's about a woman and her cruel, possessive husband.
Knowing that the two of you are meeting behind my back.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Oh, yes, you do.
This guy is a millionaire inventor who happens to be blind. He thinks his wife is out cheating on him, and he tries to beat her. He's real creepy and intimidating to begin with, but then after he dies in a laboratory explosion, things get even creepier. His wife keeps having dreams about him coming back from the dead. His charred face and blank eyes really gives me the creeps. When I first saw this movie as a kid, it freaked me out. At the time, I even said it was the scariest movie I'd ever seen. She also dreams about a younger, hunkier guy who takes her out to get married.
I even have your wedding ring.
But the whole church is full of mannequins.
This is indeed a joyful occasion, when two people become as one, and we all rejoice with you. Remember this moment. Treasure it for all of its beauty.
This is another scene that haunts me to this very day. Also great is the opening sequence with the narrator talking about dreams.
What are dreams? What do they mean?
It gets you hooked right away. Who isn't interested in dreams?
And they say if you ever complete that fall in a dream, you'll be dead.
The plot unravels and goes much deeper, taking many twists and turns. Once you start watching it, you can't turn it off. You gotta find out how it all ends. At last, the music is great. It's a little cartoony, but spine-chilling at the same time. The perfect William Castle mix. Surprisingly, this movie has never been released on DVD. I can't imagine why. It was on VHS as part of Universal's Sci-Fi collection. Who knows why a psychological thriller would be included in the same set as Tarantula, the Deadly Mantis, and It Came from Outer Space. It's not a perfect movie by any means, but it doesn't deserve to be as overlooked as it is. If you like the Twilight Zone, Alfred Hitchcock movies, and movies about dreams, you can't miss this. Go track down a VHS copy and be part of the Nightwalker cult.
Cinemassacre's Monster Madness.
Death Proof is a unique take on the slasher genre. Instead of killing people with a machete or chainsaw, this killer uses his car. It was directed by Quentin Tarantino for the second half of the double feature Grindhouse. Stop and think about that for a moment. We got 2 movies for the price of 1. How often does that ever happen?
Robert Rodriguez, Planet Terror.
Well, back in the old days, double features were common. You'd get 2 cheap, low-budget movies back to back. That's what this movie was paying tribute to. It was legitimately bringing back the double feature, but specifically the Grindhouse days, where certain theaters would show sleazy exploitation movies that were a departure from what mainstream cinemas were showing. Likewise, this new Grindhouse movie was a departure even in this modern age, getting the same kind of cult fanfare and critical bashing. As far as emulating the look and feel of a Grindhouse-era movie, Death Proof knocks it out of the park. It looks cheaply made, and it has a leisurely pace. That's what those old movies always did. They bullshit around a lot. It feels legit, but modern audiences don't take too well to this kind of stuff, especially coming from a big director like Tarantino, who's such a big movie fan that nobody else can keep up. That's why lots of audiences didn't get it. But this movie is not a one-track gimmick. What makes it really work is Kurt Russell, who plays the villain, Stuntman Mike.
And who the hell is Stuntman Mike?
He's Stuntman.
I think he's the best horror villain since Dracula. Let me explain. Take a villain that everyone knows, like, say, Michael Myers. Michael Myers sneaks up on people and kills them. Simple as that. Go all the way back to the mummy Karras. Same thing. He creeps up on people and kills them. But Dracula walks among people. He's a social beast. He talks to everybody. Even though he's a stranger, everyone finds him interesting. He's suave, and the ladies think he's charming. Just like Dracula, Stuntman Mike is the center of attention, but nobody suspects what he's going to do. He's totally in control of the situation.
Sorry. It's my mom's car.
I love the scene where he gets the girl to give him a lap dance. If you break it down for what it is, he's just some pervert who goes into a bar to chase after young women, but he succeeds. Even though he's an old, beaten-up stunt guy, he's irresistible. He talks his way through any situation, and then he goes in for the kill.
You see, we're both going left. You could have just as easily been going left too, and if that was the case, it would have been a while before you started getting scared. But since you're going the other way, I'm afraid you're gonna have to start getting scared immediately.
Okay, spoiler alert. If you don't want to know what happens, stop the video right now. So let's talk more about Stuntman Mike and what he does. He's probably the most efficient slasher villain ever because he kills all the girls in the first half of the movie. Done. Got him. When I saw this in the theater, I couldn't believe what happened. The second half of the movie has to set up a whole bunch of new girls, and that slows things down a lot. I can see why people found this boring. All the dialogue between the girls is bullshit, but you kinda need these boring parts to make the exciting parts even more exciting. The whole movie takes you on ups and downs like a roller coaster ride. It does whatever it wants. You get this uneasy sense that you never know what's going to happen next. For example, they ditch one of their friends with this creepy backwoods guy just so they can borrow his car. Never again do they mention her, and when they get the car all banged up, they seem to completely disregard having to return the car. These girls are thrill seekers who are up to speed with Stuntman Mike, literally, which culminates in the best car chase of any movie ever. Especially when Zoe Bell is hanging off the hood of the car, it's a real nail-biter. You can tell that she's doing it for real. I have mixed feelings about Stuntman Mike turned into a pussy.
I didn't mean anything! I was just playing around!
As much as I love the finale, I feel like Tarantino built up such a good villain only to throw him away as a joke and have the badass chicks win you over. It seems like he wanted to make two different movies, one about a terrifying serial killer and another about stunt girls who kick ass. The two halves even have a different look. The first half has an old film look with grain, scratches, and jump cuts.
Oh my God. Hey.
The second half switches over to a refined clarity. With a movie that was already a double feature, splitting the second movie into two movies was a tiring experience to many people. To sit through 3 hours of movies, Death Proof seemed inferior after piggybacking after Robert Rodriguez's Planet Terror, and not to mention all the funny trailers.
They just fucked with the wrong Mexican.
I think everyone needs to give Death Proof a second chance. It's best enjoyed as its own movie. You need to see it by itself. While Planet Terror is always the same experience every time I see it, Death Proof just keeps getting better every time. It's grown on me to the point where it's my favorite Tarantino film that he directed. A very quirky and unique film in its own world. Highly underrated.
Cinemassacre's Monster Madness.
Dracula's Daughter is Universal's only direct sequel to the original Dracula. Any of the others, like Son of Dracula, never seem to regard any continuity. It picks up right where it left off, with Dr. Van Helsing having just staked Dracula when the police come in and accuse him of murder. Van Helsing fully admits that he killed the man because he was a vampire, as if the police are going to believe him.
His name was Count Dracula. How long's he been dead? About 500 years.
The rest of the film centers around Countess Maria Zaleska, who, like Dracula, is a vampire, but unlike her father, she is reluctant to her vampire heritage and wants to be free of its curse.
Free to live as a woman, free to take my place in the bright world of the living.
She's played by Gloria Holden, who, like Lugosi, is very hypnotic, seductive, and creepy. In real life, it's been said she was resistant to follow the same path as Bela Lugosi. She saw him being typecast and have lots of trouble getting other roles. Nor did she want to be in a horror film at all, so it's very appropriate and in some way might have helped her on-screen persona as the reluctant vampire.
Sherry, Mario? Thank you, I never drink wine.
Countess Zaleska has also been said to be the first lesbian vampire on film. One of the most talked about scenes is when she brings a female victim over her house, in the guise that she's paying her to pose for a painting. We're not sure exactly what she's planning to do to this girl. The victim is very uncomfortable, and this makes for a very awkward and suspenseful scene.
Please don't come any closer.
She has male victims too. Her main target is a psychiatrist named Garth, who's a friend of Van Helsing. For a sequel to one of the most famous horror films of all time, it's surprising that Dracula does not make an appearance, except only briefly as a corpse, which is a wax bust of Lugosi. Still, it manages to capture some of the creepy mood of the original, and you can almost feel the presence of Lugosi hovering over it.
I am Dracula.
The only returning character here is Van Helsing, played again by Edward Van Sloan. His acting has significantly improved since the original. Before, his dialogue always had a deliberate pacing, but now he sounds more natural. His character is cool, collected, calm, and rational. Everything he says is always matter of fact, even when nobody else believes him. The character that steals the whole movie is the Countess's servant, a really weird guy named Sandor, played by Irving Pitchell. He's one of my favorite minor characters in a Universal horror film. Sandor is always monotone, and everything he says is morbid.
What do you see in my eyes?
Death.
His mere existence is to be a killjoy to the Countess. She's trying to find her happiness, but he keeps bringing her down. Watch this.
Twilight. Long shadows on the hillsides.
Evil shadows.
No, peaceful shadows. The flutter of wings in the treetops.
The wings of bats.
No, the wings of birds. From far off, the barking of a dog.
Barking because there are wolves about.
Silence.
I love it. It gets funnier every time I watch it. Now, as soon as I see his face, I start cracking up. This is a great example of dark comedy that actually works. Unfortunately, there's plenty more examples where the comedy is in there just to be stupid. This was made a year after Bride of Frankenstein, Universal's first attempt at making any kind of sequel, and a more successful one too. One of the biggest reasons for that was it had James Whale as the director. He was the master of crafting dark humor. He was originally considered for Dracula's Daughter, but unfortunately that didn't happen. It seems like they were trying to emulate his style, but failed for the most part. The movie does have a lot of other good things going for it. It's no masterpiece, but it's worth seeing. One of the things that seems to help it is that it's completely independent of the original, making it original in its own right. I mean, Dracula isn't even in it. That's what you call taking a risk and not treading over the same formula all over again. More horror films today should take note. The film ends in Transylvania, right where the first Dracula began. It's a nice way to bookend the two films. It's also worth mentioning that Universal's first wave of horror films began with Dracula and ended with Dracula's Daughter. So these Transylvania scenes also bookend the whole golden age of the genre.
The castle! The light! Dracula! He's come back. Indeed.
Cinemassacre's Monster Madness.
Are You Afraid of the Dark was a TV show on Nickelodeon. As a kid, it was one of my favorite shows because it was made especially for young teenage viewers. It appealed to our imagination and fears. It lasted all through the 90s, and it was like our generation's version of The Twilight Zone.
Submitted for your approval, one Max Phillips.
Submitted for the approval of the Midnight Society.
It was an anthology series. Each episode was a new story, but there were recurring characters, the kids who are telling the stories. They called their group the Midnight Society.
We're called the Midnight Society.
They'd meet in a secret location in the woods at a campfire and share their creepy tales. This setting alone made the show cool because I didn't know anybody whose parents would allow them to go outside at night and meet with friends in the woods and scare the shit out of each other.
What way?
I always tried to organize something like that, but it would never happen. These campfire scenes added to these stories a layer of rebellion and hipness. The stories covered vampires, werewolves, ghosts, just about every supernatural element you could think of. They weren't always that original, but for a kid in the 90s, they always seemed fresh and exciting. Lots of them were based on popular urban legends or variations on them. There's the episode Tale of the Prom Queen, about kids investigating the ghost of a girl who died waiting for her prom date to pick her up. Then there was Tale of the Pinball Wizard, which wasn't scary at all. It was about a kid who's playing a pinball game and finds himself trapped in a mall after hours with all the characters from the game coming to life. This was one of those episodes that was more fantasy than horror. My favorite ones were the scary episodes like Tale of the Super Specs, about a mysterious pair of glasses from a strange magic shop that gives a girl the power to see invisible people. Just the idea that there could be these faceless figures in black moving among us that we can't see was an idea that really got under my skin. Then there was the tale of the laughing in the dark, the mandatory clown episode. A kid goes into a funhouse where there waits a scary clown at the end. He steals the clown's nose because of a dare from his friends, and next thing the clown follows him home. I was never afraid of clowns like many people, but the idea of an inanimate character from a funhouse following you back to your house really freaked me out. It also has that traditional scare where he gets a phone call and it turns out the call is coming from inside the house. Yeah, remember landline phones? Where more than one person in the house could pick up on the same line?
Josh, we only have one phone. It's gotta be at your house.
If you don't give it back, I'll come up and get it.
The intro to the show was especially creepy. I'll never forget those empty swings and that weird dummy in the attic. This show may not be as great as I remember, but I still regard it as classic. It takes me back to a time when I wanted to have my own Midnight Society and throw magic dust on the fire. What was that stuff? It drove me crazy for years until I found out that it was just non-dairy creamer. And yes, it works. The show captures a child's sense of imagination, stories told by kids for kids. Telling scary stories in the dark or around a campfire is a pastime, something magical that gets lost as we become an adult. But when you're at your day job, drinking your coffee, drink it with some magic dust.
Cinemassacre's Monster Madness.
Young Frankenstein is one of the greatest comedies from Mel Brooks. After his collaborations with actor Gene Wilder on The Producers and Blazing Saddles, Gene came to Mel with the idea of a Frankenstein parody. At first, Mel didn't want to do it, but Gene convinced him. Gene plays the grandson of the infamous Dr. Frankenstein, who doesn't want to be associated with the family name. He doesn't want anything to do with his grandfather's experiments. But after he inherits the family estate, he meets a bunch of weird characters, and he steadily begins following in the footsteps of Frankenstein.
What a filthy job.
What makes the movie work so well is Gene Wilder's performance.
Let me out. Let me out of here. Get me the hell out of here.
There's something about him I can't explain. Every one of Mel Brooks' movies he's in, his face just radiates with comedy. He takes shouting to a whole new level.
My name is Frankenstein!
There's plenty of over-the-top scenes where he gets real hyper-dramatic, but my favorite moments are when he's more subdued. There's an awkward feeling. You're waiting for him to come unhinged.
Would the doctor care for a brandy before retiring?
No. Thank you.
Some warm milk, perhaps?
No, thank you very much. No thanks.
Ovaltine.
Nothing. Thank you.
The supporting roles are all great. That's Cloris Leachman as the mysterious housekeeper and Marty Feldman as Igor.
No, it's pronounced Igor.
It's clear that this movie was made as a loving tribute to the Universal Frankenstein films, mainly Frankenstein for its classic brain-robbing and iconic creation scene, Bride of Frankenstein for the blind old man scene and the monster's mate, and the whole plot is sort of a retread of Son of Frankenstein and even has the wooden-armed inspector. They even used the same lab equipment from the original Frankenstein, and obviously it's filmed in black and white, capturing the authentic atmosphere of one of those movies. It feels like a legit Universal classic, but one that just happened to be made in the 70s and happens to be incredibly funny.
Don't put the candle back.
It isn't even that far off because Bride of Frankenstein had a lot of humor to begin with.
Good, good.
Young Frankenstein could have easily passed as a true Frankenstein sequel, and if Gene Wilder's character is the grandson, that would mean he was the child in Son of Frankenstein. He even has the same curly hair.
It could work!
Today, Young Frankenstein is still regarded as one of the funniest movies ever made and has helped introduce newer generations to the classic Frankenstein films.
Cinemassacre's Monster Madness.
You know, there aren't many Halloween movies. Sure, there's tons of horror movies that all have the elements that we associate with Halloween, vampires, werewolves, ghosts, all that stuff, but it's not often when you find a movie that encompasses everything that is Halloween. Even the famous horror franchise that bears the title Halloween are all just about a masked serial killer. Sure, they use the holiday as the setting, but they don't really go much deeper into the true spirit of what Halloween really is. The closest it came was with Halloween 3: Season of the Witch, a movie that attempted to branch the series out into an anthology series and explore all the other Halloween traditions. But everyone hated it because it didn't have Michael Myers, because it didn't do the same thing all over again. But then finally came a movie called Trick or Treat, which succeeded in giving us that good old Halloween feeling. Just look at all the jack-o'-lanterns. They're everywhere. This movie literally glows of Halloween. Describing the plot would be difficult in a short amount of time because it's all over the place. It's an anthology film with separate stories, except for the fact that all the stories are happening at the same time rather than one after another, and that they all cross over. We have masked children coming back from the dead, werewolves, an awkward knife-wielding neighbor who takes Halloween traditions real serious, and on the other side of the spectrum, an old John Carpenter look-alike who hates the holiday.
A custom that is now known as trick-or-treat.
Christ.
Basically, he's the Halloween version of Ebenezer Scrooge.
Happy Halloween!
Screw you!
Then there's Sam, a strange character with a burlap sack over his head, kind of like Jason Voorhees in Friday the 13th Part 2. He's the enforcer, the protector of Halloween rituals. Somehow this character is so instantly lovable that I can see him as the official Halloween mascot. Think about it, every holiday has its own character. Easter has the Easter Bunny, Christmas has Santa, but Halloween never had just one thing. Sam is a brilliant attempt to be that. He's a character that the writer-director Michael Dougherty created for a short animated film years before. It's true that great ideas always stick with you. Even without the sack on his head, Sam's face does not disappoint. It looks like the face of a fetus. It captures both childhood innocence and mischief, which goes along perfectly with the Halloween spirit. That's the best way I can sum it up. The movie balances the mischievous and fun-loving nature of the holiday and pays respect to some of the grim origins of how Halloween really got started. It's surprising that this movie never got a wide theatrical release. Only due to a cult following did it get my attention. I think Halloween is the most nostalgic time of the year, even more so than Christmas. It's a coming-of-age holiday where you dress up as somebody you're not, you venture outside your own home, knock on somebody's door who you don't know, and eat candy that you know isn't good for you. Every year we're reminded of that time. We try to recapture that feeling of being a kid on the scariest but greatest night of the year. Happy Halloween.